Hello, everyone. Good to see everyone again, although we don't really see you, but you see us, I hope. I'm Ori Nir. I'm with Americans for Peace Now. I'm the Vice President for Public Affairs, and I'm joined today by our Director of Government Relations, Madeline Cheragino. And we would also like to welcome to the webinar Dana Mills of Shalom Achshav. She will actually introduce herself in a moment. I see that people are still joining. We can see the count, so I'm going to do the trick that Hadar always does, and then just slow down a little bit and let people join us, and then we'll start. Maybe this will be a good time to make our two usual housekeeping notes. One is that this webinar, as you always know, is recorded. You'll be able to find the audio version of it on our podcast, Peacecast, sometime later today. And the video version will be on YouTube probably sometime tomorrow. The other note is that you're always encouraged to ask questions. We ask that you do it using the Q&A tool, not the raise hand tool. The Q&A tool is at the bottom of your screen. And on this session, actually more than even others in the past, it'll be great if you ask your questions concisely. If you just put in, one or at the most two sentences, because we read the questions as we go along, and it's kind of difficult to conduct a conversation and read a long question. You can start asking questions as of now, if you'd like. So we're here to talk about settler violence. It's something that's been in the news, obviously, quite a bit in recent days. In recent years, it's a phenomenon that has gained momentum throughout the West Bank, has accelerated. And there's a new settler violence report that was released last week by Peace Now, by the Settlement Watch team of Peace Now. And it's an interesting, unique report in that it reviewed the documentation of 1,200 violent incidents of settler violence from 2012 until July of this year. This was data that was collected by the Israeli human rights organization Yesh Din. And what Peace Now did was examining the location of those incidents and their proximity to various settlements, or more precisely to mostly illegal outposts in the West Bank, and Dana will talk about it. So we are privileged and to have Dana with us, Dana Mills. She'll discuss the findings of the report and a lot of other things that relate to settler violence. And Dana, I'm going to ask you to first maybe introduce yourself just briefly, and then go ahead and talk about the report. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ori, and it's great to be here. Thank you everyone for joining. I am the External Relations of Peace Now since, Director of Peace Now since March of this year. I joined Peace Now when I was 13 in the 90s. I was a youth activist in the movement, and I learned what I know about politics really by going to protest expansion of settlements, by going to protest for peace. And that was a very crucial time, as you know, for Israel, Palestine, and sort of the prospects for peace. After pursuing 2 degrees in politics, a short career as a dancer, short but important career as a dancer, which really informed how I understand the world and is still a big part of my life. I went on to do a PhD at Oxford and taught there for 13 years. And then I left the world of academia to come back and do good. And I'm really, really happy to be here with you, albeit in a difficult context, but I'm glad that you joined to talk about this important subject. And I'd be very glad to hear from you and elaborate on anything that you might find helpful and interesting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the background for the report, and then I'm going to talk about our findings, and especially I'm going to leave some time to give you sort of the analysis and why this is important and why this is so viral right now, because literally settler violence was trending on Israeli Twitter a couple of days ago, something that rarely happens with issues to do with the occupation. And I think this is kind of giving you all the kind of background that if you would just read the report, you wouldn't get. So I hope you will find it helpful. As already mentioned, this report drew on analysis compiled by Yesh Din. It's an excellent human rights organization. Its current CEO, Lior Amichai, is a dear friend of Peace Now and APN and worked in Peace Now for years. And with this data, we found that out of 1,256 incidents of violence, this includes, by the way, vandalism, hurting agriculture, and human injuries, 796 events, 63% of them occurred close to illegal outposts. 584 events, 46.5% of that were hurting human beings. 560, that's 44%, were damaging property. And 6.3% were basically taking over land through violence. And I'll talk about that also later. I have to stop for 1 second and say the reason why it's important to also talk about vandalism and damaging of property is that this in itself is violation of human rights and part of the tactic of taking over land. So for instance, you might have heard in the recent harvest season, that was an exceptionally violent season when Palestinian olive groves are being damaged. People lose their livelihood. It's an economic damage. It's a violation of human rights. So it's really important to put this in context and understand why we're measuring all of these incidents together. It's not to belittle any part of them. Our findings were very unequivocal, as you see. 63% of those events, all in all, were done around illegal outposts. I'm going to name those outposts. And in the report itself, you will find all the background around those outposts and what brought them into being. I will say that all of them are illegal and a lot of them have been put on the ground several times. So they were evicted and then the settlers came back, etc. So this is a long process in which the army and the state is involved and fully knows that the settlers are there. The illegal outposts in which the most violence had occurred are illegal outposts around Yitzhar, which is a very notorious area for violence, and indeed the highest of all. Adei Ad, Esh Kodesh, Chavat Ma'on, Givat Ronen, and Chomesh. I have to stop here and say that sadly, the issues we talk about change all the time, and very sadly, just now there was an incident of shooting at settlers around Chomesh. So when we talk about settler violence, we're talking about circular sort of attacks, and we're very sorry to hear about those injuries. However, the analysis that we'll present to you today is kind of overarching understanding of settler violence as part of the occupation and taking over land. But no one wins.
Dana, maybe we should just say,
yeah.
I'm sorry, that Chomesh is in the northern part of the West Bank, and it was one of 4, if I remember correctly, settlements that were actually evicted, during the 2005 disengagement.
Exactly, thank you, Ori. And yes, and it's north to Nablus, and it indeed was evicted during 2005. And since then, again, there have been several returns against army orders, against state intervention, but still the settlers are there. So one thing that is important to understand the framework through which we analyze settler violence. As I said, settler violence has been in the news quite a lot. Peace Now, as a movement that focuses on settlement expansion and how settlements are gaining traction on the ground, looks at settler violence as another method to gain control over land. Through settler violence, settlers are basically, they chase Palestinians away from their own land. They create a mechanism of deterrence. So we see settler violence as a way to put settlements and illegal outposts in this case as facts on the ground and to deter Palestinians from accessing their lands. So one thing that is really important, and now I'm kind of segueing into more of an analysis element of what I'm going to talk to you about, there's a lot of discussion, especially from the right on the Israeli map, saying that, oh, of course, these things are terrible, but these are a few bad apples. These are a few hooligans, people who are disobedient to the law, and we cannot understand this as a structural phenomenon. Our position is, of course, we're not saying that all settlers are violent, but this is definitely not just a fringe phenomenon. This is part and parcel of how the occupation sustains itself. And the state of Israel, by overlooking settler violence, allows these tactics to go on. So it's really important to understand that it's not just a few bad apples, it's not just a few people who are sort of letting loose, but this is part and parcel of how the occupation sustains itself. At the same time, it's really important to understand that when we say not all settlers are violent, we're also not talking about benign occupation. We don't want to normalize the occupation. We don't want settlers to be non-violent in illegal outposts. We want illegal outposts to not be where they are. We are calling for eviction of illegal outposts. So again, of course, in the shorter term, we would like to see more enforcement. We would like to see more control over settler violence, because we support Palestinian human rights. It's a core feature of what we do. However, our object as Peace Now is to call for eviction of those illegal outposts, and not to say, if you're not violent, then you should be able to stay there on Palestinian land. So that's a really important qualification. I should say something about the methodology of this analysis, which is very much related to what I just said. The analysis of these 1,256 complaints, we know that this is partial data. We know that not all Palestinians complain, not all data comes to the police, because Palestinians know that nothing will be done about their complaints. So this is not in any way conclusive data in the sense of we don't have full data of how many attacks happen everywhere. But this is actually telling of the phenomenon, the fact that Palestinians don't feel emboldened to come and complain and come forward, sometimes in really, really horrible cases of attack. So the fact that we have partial data also shows you how volatile this phenomenon actually is. I want to talk a little bit about what this means within Israel. I'm talking to you today from Tel Aviv, and it's a very different reality to the reality that we might see, the kind of images you would see on the report or other depictions of settler violence. For many Israelis on the other side of the Green Line, it's very hard to feel the occupation in the everyday. If you live in Tel Aviv or even some areas of Jerusalem, life is not that unusual, and it's not unlike a lot of other Western countries. And then only sometimes 20 minutes or half an hour away, life is very, very different, and all these horrible attacks that we've been discussing take place almost on a daily basis. Recently, it's been almost on a daily basis. And when this issue of settler violence started coming to the news, and I should say by a very, very important and long-standing work of human rights organizations, there's strong collaboration between organizations we work with, those who document human rights abuse and bring this to our awareness and to stakeholders' awareness. The data also started coming to the Israeli public. And that is where it's really important to say most Israeli public was deeply shocked and ashamed by this. Most Israeli public, including people who might be indifferent to settlements, who might say things like, oh, we don't know how many settlements we can evict, we don't know they've been there for a long time, etc. When they see these incidents, this is very shocking to them. And I think this is also true of the international community. When people see these scenes abroad, you start getting the image of what's going on inside the occupation. So it's really important. One reason we bring this phenomenon to talk about the agenda that we're pursuing, which is to talk about the two-state solution within the boundaries of 1967, while also calling for eviction of settlements, is to show the price of the occupation. Israel has continued to normalize the occupation and shrinking the conflict or creating some kind of fake status quo. But this status quo is violent infringement of human rights of Palestinians every day. Settler violence shows the extreme of that. It shows what it's like to live under 54-year-old military occupation. So if you feel shocked by those images, if you find them hard, just think about the fact that for many people, this is every day. And this is the kind of change that has been happening in the Israeli public discourse. And the fact that this is trending on Twitter, and suddenly ministers from left and right have to give opinions about this, is not only unusual, but is really very important. And this is going to lead me to my next point. As you know, since June, we've had a coalition government. It's been nicknamed the change government. We can talk about whether or not it is afterwards, but it's this coalition that is from the settler lobby. So the right of this coalition is the pro-settlement lobby, to an anti-occupation left, including some people who were general directors of Peace Now and are now sitting in the Knesset. And this very unusual coalition means, and I should say also really important, the first ever Palestinian party is part of the coalition. This is the first ever incident of such a thing in Israel. And what is very interesting in the discussion about settler violence is that through responses to this, you really see the divides within the coalition. The pro-settler lobby is trying to get away from those discussions and trying to talk about, oh yes, these are a few bad apples. I mean, everyone kind of, when you see the pictures, say, oh, this is horrible, this shouldn't be endorsed, etc. But the pro-settler lobby, or even I would say the mild right would say, this is very extreme, and why are you showing only that? The other discussion point is, why are you not talking about Palestinian violence? Of course, again, here we're talking about giving the bigger picture of taking over someone else's land and using violence as part of that mechanism vis-a-vis other forms of violence. Not that I'm condoning any kind of violence, but it's really important to look at them differently. Yeah. Whereas from the center to the left, and it's very interesting here because even parties that are benign to the occupation, that don't have an explicit position neither on the two-state solution nor on ending the occupation, a lot of those parties still condemn settler violence and say this is horrible and this must be stopped. And this brings me back and circling back a little bit to our report and talking about illegal outposts, which again are the most extreme form of settlements. These are settlements that are not legislated in any way, that are not, there's no way to actually monitor what's going on there, and basically pushes the state of Israel to treat them as facts on the ground. And the fact that shall we say, the center left, or even sometimes the center right, finds those difficult to deal with, really should enable us to push more the general issue of the occupation. Because for us, again, as Peace Now, the problem isn't just settler violence. The problem is the settlements. The settlements are the place from which the violent settlers come from. So our call is not just to have more enforcement. Some organizations are calling for that, and that's fine. We want to see illegal outposts being dealt with according to the rule of law. We want to see them evicted. We want to see enforcement in that way. And we don't want to retract to this discussion again of not all settlers are violent, let's have less violent settlers, but we want to see less settlements, because the real problem is having facts on the ground that are really in themselves violation of human rights of Palestinians. So this is a really crucial moment for us in Israel. This is a moment in which we have very good allies, both inside and internationally, who are supporting our work, really, the work that I started circa 30 years ago against the occupation for the two-state solution. But we also see huge pushback from the right, and we see that on every single issue that we face. I really thank all of you who support Americans for Peace Now, and through that our work in Peace Now, because this is a moment that is really very, very vital for us. And this is a moment in which we will need all our supporters. We're all doing this work together. So when we talk about settler violence, when we talk about how to counter it, this is the moment we have to stop and say the way to counter settler violence is to end the occupation and to move to a peace agreement based on the two-state solution. I'm going to stop there to leave enough time for questions, but thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to take anything on from here.
Thank you so much, Donna. I'm going to kick it off with a question, which I've been wondering, but also we had someone already write in about it. You know, you mentioned a little bit about the reception to the report and how this conversation has really taken off in Israel in the past week, and it's trending on Twitter. And I wanted to ask you if you could just discuss a little more about what happened. I know that there was a conversation between U.S. Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Victoria Nuland, with Minister of Public Security, Omer Bar-Lev, where the issue of settler violence was raised, and if you could share a bit more about what happened after that.
Okay, thanks. Great questions. So yes, as I said, it's a very unusual time in that it's not often discussed internationally, the relationship between Israel's internal law enforcement, settler violence, which is obviously part and parcel of its internal enforcement. And that was raised in a meeting between Undersecretary of State and Omer Bar-Lev, who is our internal security minister. I should say that Omer Bar-Lev is a Peace Now veteran. He was an activist in the movement many, many years ago. And he is a minister from the Labour Party, so not a kind of anti-occupation explicit, I would say, campaigner in the government at this point. And Bar-Lev said something very mild. I appreciate the question written. It was a very kind of effusive, something saying that we too are concerned by settler violence and we think it's a terrible thing, something along those lines. And he was heavily critiqued by others in the coalition by saying, do you say that all settlers are violent? So this is the usual detraction, is so saying, are you saying that all settlers are violent? In which case, again, it's really important to keep in mind what I was saying just now, is that we're talking about the settlements. We're not just talking about violent settlers, but the settlements as a cause of violence. But that conversation exploded in a way that no one could foresee, and brought out a lot of other discussions. I just saw a very good piece today that quoted Yair Lapid, foreign minister, who also gave a few comments and said, I find this a very worrying phenomenon that we must treat. So again, ministers who are not usually at the helm of anti-occupation work are now making explicit comments on settler violence. At the same time, as I said, the pushback from the right is great. And the usual accusations are kind of saying the left never cares about Palestinian violence against settlers. I mean, they don't call settlers settlers, they call them the new pioneers. This is the whitewashing of language. And the kind of pushback is around that narrative mostly. And the not all settlers are violent, which again is something that we fight with tooth and nail, because it's really important to say we are not looking for pleasant settlers. We don't want you to just behave and do what you think is right. We want illegal outposts to be evicted so that the rule of law in itself will be upheld. So the detraction of the discourse is really interesting here, as is the pushback. But I think, again, it's very interesting because it's hard to defend even from the right, apart from the very far settler right. It's hard to defend the incidents and the images that are coming out. There was, I use the word not lightly and with a very heavy heart, but a pogrom that we remember on the last day of Sukkot, in the South Hebron Hills. We all remember the pictures of children who have been injured in various incidents. Some of the pictures of, I have to say also, I don't want to belittle it, because you cannot underestimate in many communities that are poor and are struggling economically, when you see pictures of slaughtered sheep or olive groves that are cut down mid-harvest. This is hurting people's lives. These are people who are losing their livelihood. So when you see all these images, even if you are benign center-right Israeli, either politically involved or not, and even if you are a center-right politician, it's very hard to defend those images. It's very hard to create a coherent narrative around them. But again, for us, it's really important to bring back the conversation about the occupation and not to talk about specific incidents.
I'd like to remind our attendees that you are welcome to ask questions, and to do that, you use your Q&A tool that's on the bottom of your screen. Dana, we'll come back to the report and to what it means, and zoom in on pieces of it in a moment. I actually want to ask you to zoom out a little bit and talk a little bit about the evolution of settler violence in past years. And here I want to, and I'm posting now a report that I have written 10 years ago about price tag. Of course, settler violence goes back to the beginning, of settlements, to the beginning of the occupation, basically. But something happened 12 years ago, a little more than that, that gave birth to this phenomenon of price tag. And the imperative of price tag was for the settlers to inflict, and we're talking, of course, about extremist settlers, not everyone. So always make this kind of clarification. To inflict pain on the Palestinians, to target the Palestinians, in order to apply pressure on the Israeli government not to take down illegal outposts. That was, largely that was the idea. What I think we've seen in past years, and particularly in the past, I'd say 2 years or so, is a real shift, a transformation in the dynamics. And today, the imperative is not so much to apply pressure on the Israeli government through violence that targets Palestinians, but to actually try to drive out Palestinians, to try to create more room for settlers to take over Palestinian land and land in the West Bank in general, rather than to apply pressure on the Israeli government and to deter it. If you agree with me with my theory, how do you explain it?
Well, that's really helpful. Thank you. I think that basically what you're describing and the shift towards stopping to pressurize Israeli governments just shows sadly the success of those illegal outposts and settlers to become facts on the ground. They don't need to influence Israeli governments anymore because they know they'll be there. They know they're not under any threat of eviction and certainly not under this government. I saw one question in the chat around enforcement, which is really vital here. There's very little, if any, law enforcement over settler violence. So if a Palestinian will commit an act of violence, they will be arrested within minutes, and very often people who are hardly anything to do with this incident will be arrested and will be prosecuted with very little respect to their human rights. When a settler commits an act of settler violence, there's very little, if any, response. That we have statistics of other human rights organizations that show very little enforcement in that way. So basically what you're describing, Ori, is that they have won, the settlers, unless we do something and we act, because it's never too late. You know, they all believe it's too late. None of us will get up and do our jobs. But as long as we are oblivious to the phenomenon, as long as we say, yes, they're there, there's nothing we can do about it, then the settlers understand that they have a free hand to do what they want. There'll be no enforcement, there'll be no sanctions. And it's basically a way to create a sphere of lawlessness. And I want to talk about that for a minute, because one thing we've seen growing in the West Bank over recent years is really a regime of lawlessness. There's very little enforcement. The army, if anything, stands back, doesn't get involved, hardly ever protects Palestinians. So settlers now understand that they have free hand to do what they want. And we use the terms in Hebrew, we use the term of Jewish terrorism. We don't use it lightly and we use it with a very heavy heart, but it is part of a mechanism of creating, like any terrorism, it's a way to deter the people around you, you know, in the same way that terrorism is used internationally, and we're all victims of terrorism, each one of us in our respective communities. So the way that settlers are now using settler violence is a deterrence mechanism, as a way to really create this fear of lawlessness and to deter everyone from interfering, both the state of Israel, of course, Palestinian communities, they have no way to push back against this. And I should say, and this is, I'm talking to our listeners abroad, the international community. I mean, we are all implicated in this. American taxes go towards a lot of defense mechanisms that fall into, sadly, the occupation. And I think, you know, I'm a firm believer in human rights, and I think we're all accountable to issues like that are happening under our watch. And the longer that this will go without action, the longer that there'll be lawlessness, there'll be no response from the international community, there'll be no response from other communities, we will just see it getting worse. Unfortunately, we won't see any change on the ground from the settlers themselves, because they have nothing going against them. They know they'll have no sanctions.
Just a quick note about enforcement, which you talked about. While you were talking, I looked really quickly at some data. So this is Yesh Din data from 2019, and it shows that so as you pointed out, very few Palestinians actually go and complain to the Israeli police. Obviously, it's a statement of, you know, if you do that. Of the very few cases that were actually reported, 91% ended without 91% of the cases of the files ended without an indictment. And of the ones where there was actually an indictment, there was a handful, really a handful of actual cases where people were prosecuted and found guilty.
Yeah. And I mean, there was a comment in the chat, lawlessness is enabling, is complicity. And I completely agree with that. Thank you. I think we're seeing how the state becomes benign and allows this. And again, all mechanisms that enable the state. And that's why, again, it's very easy for the discourse in Israel to talk about the bad apples, to talk about the hooligans, the extremists. There's even some discussion that we're trying to push back against of like those youth who have become implicated in those actions, who are the perpetrators of violence, as some kind of lost youth who don't have enough support sociologically or whatever. It's true, by the way, a lot of them are without structures and are without proper schooling, but it is because they are living around illegal outposts. So the answer is not just to give them better support. The answer is to give them support that they need within the borders of the Israeli state. But there has been that discussion, I should say, in context when you asked about pushback against the critique of settler violence. Some of it has been, oh, look, these are lost youth. They're just, those kind of, like everywhere you have kids who are doing bad things. But this is part of a state mechanism. This is part of, as you said, this is part of getting hold of land. This is part of scaring people from accessing their own land through acts of violence. And I mean, you should also think about this idea of price tag. I'm really grateful that you brought that up, because that in itself is such a horrible concept. It's basically creating some kind of vindictive action against every single perceived Palestinian action. And very often it just happens on its own, kind of without any reason. But we're talking about basically groups of people who have taken the law into their own hands, who are conducting kind of offenses on their own initiative without any control, without any intervention from any state mechanism. We know very well from history that these groups of people who take law into their own hands, they are not just the outliers, they are a symptom of the system. And it's really important to understand them as such. And I don't have to go into historical examples, but we all understand the kind of context I'm talking about. So when we see these kind of price tags, when we see settler violence, this is part of a system that in itself is violent. Settlements are violent. Taking over people's land is violent. Creating a 54-year-old military occupation is violent. This in itself is infringement on human rights. So we are just seeing visually the extreme of that, but it's nothing unusual, and it's definitely nothing outside of the system.
Thank you, Donna. We talked a little bit about the United States' reaction to settler violence as of late, but I'm actually curious. I know you have conversations with more than just the United States. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about the reaction of the Europeans to this kind of information.
Yes, so Europe and beyond, Australia, Japan have plenty of people who have been showing great concern. So I mean, this exponential rise in settler violence, and I should say there have been more violent attacks from January to June than the entire 2020. So we're seeing huge surges of settler violence, and this has been worrying around the world. And I think, again, for those who care about the fate of Israel and Palestine and want to see a peaceful two-state solution, it's not surprising. For most people who are aware of what life is like on the West Bank, as always, from his many years around, and many others who are around, it's not anything surprising, but it is still very shocking. And many of our European partners and others have just been calling and saying, what is it that we can do about this? What is it that the world can do? And I think there's a feeling of the need for accountability, which we very much appreciate, I have to say, because again, I think an injury to one is an injury to all. And we see so many attacks on a daily basis. And the images are really shocking. I mean, when we worked on the report, it was really hard to sift through the images because a lot of them were so graphic. We thought, yes, they illustrate what's going on, but do we want to use that on a report that will be, freely disseminated and will be used as an advocacy tool, really? So the concern has been far-ranging and includes, many countries that are interested in the fate of these two countries here. And I know this has been raised in many conversations with political leaders and many meetings. And so up till now, I've not seen a formal intervention. I've not seen anyone saying, look, this has to stop unless, and that remains to be seen. And again, I think that's where our report is really important. And I'm not just plugging it because I am with Peace Now with all my heart. But again, the idea is to talk about the settlements. And if people around the world see the images and find them deeply disturbing, which I know they do, the question is what system allows them to sustain themselves. So it's been a season of across the board discussions around settler violence, and especially questions of why are we seeing such a peak? Why is it escalating so much? I think, clearly, this is something to do also with this current government, which we know will never do anything to change its policy in the West Bank at this point. I should say that this government was founded on a political status quo, meaning that neither its left nor its right should be able to push any steps unilaterally. What we are seeing in effect is that the right is pushing more and more steps in terms of settlement takeover and in terms of, non-responding to phenomena as part of the occupation, whereas the left is still very benign. So that is something that, again, when we talk to our partners about settler violence, this is something that we hear a lot. It's like, why is the left not acting more? And what about the status quo? But I would say that settler violence sadly shows us that there's no such thing as a status quo, that the status quo means daily injuries, means daily vandalism, and means living without a system of a rule of law in large parts of the land between the river and the sea.
Madeline, you asked about the Europeans, about international community and so on. I'll just tell you anecdotally, when I was in Israel just now during the month of November, I joined the Peace Now tour of the West Bank for diplomats, mainly Europeans. Dana was on it together with Hagit Ofran. And it was really interesting to see the interest, and there was a great deal of interest among the diplomats in this phenomenon of settler violence. We met with Palestinians who were actually victims of settler violence and heard from them, which was, I thought, very instructive, very interesting. Then I wanted, since you referred to this issue, I wanted to ask you to maybe elaborate a little bit about the discussion that we've seen in this past week in the government, in the coalition, regarding settler violence, and maybe use it as a prism to examine the dynamic between left and right within the governing coalition, and mainly perhaps deal with a question which I know is very much on the mind of Israeli progressives, of whether the presence of left-leaning parties like Meretz and Labor in the government serves as a fig leaf, or do they actually have power to influence there?
Okay, that's a great question, Oli. Thank you. So this government has been in office since June. I should say that in the beginning, both locally and internationally, there was a great feeling of fragility. No one wanted to see this government fail. No one wanted to see Netanyahu back. So in the beginning, I think it wasn't just suspicion, but it was like dealing with care and thinking, okay, if we push too hard, if we argue against every issue, then maybe the government will collapse and we will get Netanyahu after 12 years, I should say, of having consecutive leadership from Netanyahu, and absolutely not only non-status quo, but retreat in many issues to do with the settlements. This government has proven in some ways effective, I should say, in governance of everyday life. And again, I'm now distinguishing between issues that are not to do with our discussion, that are not to do with the occupation, in which ministers are getting work done after many years of stagnation in public life. And at the same time, it is important to say, in any issue that we're working on, we have absolutely seen not only that this government isn't better, but it's actually worse. So we published a report not so long ago entitled "A Government of Change for the Worse." And, spoiler in the title, what we think about this government. Just to name a few issues that we've been dealing with, you might have seen that in your Americans for Peace Now emails. E1, that's entitled "The Doomsday Settlement," featured in Haaretz and New York Times around that. No government has dared to engage with it, and suddenly plans to build in it are being furthered. The discussion on E1 has now been postponed to the 10th of January, but it's absolutely not off the table. Atarot, another area that Ori and I visited alongside diplomats, very volatile for the two-state solution between Jerusalem and Ramallah. So these are all areas that no government before had dared to do anything with, and this government is pushing very strongly from the right. So it's not that we see that the right is basically handling this government with its gloves on, I should say. At the same time, I do want to say that I don't think that the left is just a fig leaf, because the left is still pushing from its direction, and we are managing to get policies either pushed forward or sometimes when we need to sort of inform of issues at stake, etc., it is helpful to have partners in government. I should say that Peace Now has not had partners in the coalition since the 90s. So this is a very big change for us as a political movement and as advocacy partner, really. So, again, I believe that the left isn't just a fig leaf. I think that many people on the left in government have enough integrity to realize that if they do understand one day that they're merely a fig leaf, they will stand up and leave, also because they will not get their interest through. This is an especially difficult period because Naftali Bennett, who is, he was the head of Yesha, he's a settler in heart, lives in Ra'anana, is a prime minister. So he's not even, and he is opposed to the two-state solution, and he is a supporter of an apartheid state annexation. He's not hiding this agenda. This is not something that he shrinks away from. At the same time, you have people like Bar-Lev sitting in the Minister of Interior Defense, you have Merav Michaeli as Minister of Transport, and you have Tamar Zandberg and Isawe Frej in very important offices for Meretz. So the left does have some influence, although again, sadly, the right is really pushing its limits. And again, I think here it's really important to understand that this has to be a collaborative pushback against those agendas. So Iwan and Atarot, really two very crucial plans. I should say in many ways, they are dangerous for the future of Israel-Palestine, not less than settler violence. Settler violence is very graphic and it's shocking. But building 9,000 units between Jerusalem and Ramallah, as Atarot might be, is endangering people's lives for many decades to come. So when we talk about settlements, we're talking about this holistic phenomenon and not just parts and parcels of it.
Oh, speaking of Atarot, I have a question for you that dovetails nicely with that, which comes from someone in the chat. So we've seen the United States under Biden push back. Of course, we would like them to see them push back stronger, but it has happened, right? With Victoria Nuland just this week on settler violence, with the call between Blinken and Bennett on Atarot, with other statements coming out of the administration. And yet, repeatedly, we've seen that kind of get ignored. What do you think the United States needs to do to actually get through to Bennett that we're serious and make it clear that we are meaning exactly what we say?
I mean, that's a really great question. Thank you for asking that. I would say show that that there would be a price if Israel continues as it does. Deeds, not words, is a slogan that comes to mind. Not just picking up the phone, which in itself is threatening and it's a big deal. A phone call around the settlement plan is not something that happens usually, and it is really important to note. But also, I know that APN has been discussing conditioning aid, so this comes to mind as something that is possibly something that can be done along science lines, saying you want to build an E1, well, here are the parts of aid that you could omit and you could lose, for instance. But yes, I think it's a very big question. I think just making clear that this is not empty threats, that there is something at stake. I know that there's been a lot of discussion around Iran. That's another issue that has been in the news continuously in both our respective homelands. So, if Israel is so keen to have partnership and support around safety around Iran, then maybe Israel shouldn't be breaking international promises around building and settlements. That could be one way the conversation could go. If we're talking about partnerships, they have to go both ways. At this point, it's a very unilateral partnership. Minister Gantz, who I should say is in charge of a lot of these plans, is currently in the US. He should know what it means, the fact that he doesn't stop Atarot or Iwan. He has absolutely the authority and the ability to stop both these plans. And maybe it should be made clearer to him what happens if he doesn't stop them and what that means in terms of the relationship between the US and Israel. So, it is very painful to say that. I think, the US has been our long-standing partner and friend from the day that Israel was founded. But perhaps perhaps it's time to say you can't just do as you please and continue without having any repercussions for that. So that would be my take, I guess. But a really good question.
No, I would add to that it, at least in my analysis, the most recent experience we had with Atarot actually does show that pressure works. And this is not tooting our own horn.
I mean, it's not off the table yet, though. So I wouldn't say that yet. No, definitely not publicly.
Okay. So
I mean, when Gantz decides to stop.
Yeah, go ahead.
When Gantz stops publicly at Atarot and says we cannot build there, it's dangerous, then I'll say that international pressure works. At this point, we've been seeing continuous deferral returns. I mean, I should say in parenthesis, E1 was actually to friends abroad, you will be shocked. The discussion around E1 was scheduled for the 27th of December. This is not coincidence. Israel knows very well that everyone is on holiday mode, and no one, I felt really guilty telling all my diplomatic friends, like, listen, this is what we're going to do 2 days after Christmas. But this is the way that Israel is now treating the international community. So unless we see actually halting of plans, I'm afraid it's not good enough to just push the can down the road. It's better than nothing, but at this point, and especially from the American point of view, with all the money and support that it gives Israel, just saying you're postponing this by a month or by 2 months or whatever, it's simply not good enough. We want to see stopping of plans. We want to see commitment to the two-state solution. We want to see commitment to obligations that have been made either orally or in writing with many past administrations. So this is the kind of commitment we want to see, not just postponing by a month or so.
Yeah, I'll rephrase it. What I meant to say is that it shows that the Israeli government is acute to what Washington has to say.
Yeah,
they listen to it and they take action accordingly. True, they haven't completely abolished it. They haven't decided to shelve it forever. But there definitely does show that they're listening to the messages that come from Washington. I wanted to relay a question that we see that came from a couple actually of people who are sending us questions, and that has to do with Peace Now and APN's commitment to the two-state solution. Many people say that the viability of a two-state solution is dwindling. Why is it that Peace Now is still supportive of the two-state solution?
Thank you. This is a question that we ask ourselves every day. And in no way are we just stagnating on the two-state solution because we once decided in the 90s that it was good and we're stuck there. We're currently thinking about it. At present, we see the two-state solution as the most viable way to end the occupation and to move to any kind of just peace. I should say that we see the two-state solution as a way to end the occupation and to achieve some kind of transitional justice. No one is signing and saying this is what we want forever. It might be that in the future, the two-state solution morphs into some kind of federation or into anything else. But in order to stop the occupation, in order to end the reality that you can see in this report, and I've been describing to you over this past hour, we need some kind of mechanism to create separation between two communities that clearly are not managing to live together. And I should say, we've been talking about building plans that are in very dangerous locations to the two-state solution. We've been talking about illegal outposts. If we abandon the idea of the two-state solution, we abandon the idea of stopping any kind of settlement expansion, we abandon any idea of evicting illegal outposts. So in reality, what we are condemning people is to a lifetime of living in very volatile relationships. When we're talking about settler violence, how will this be different under one state? I have no idea. There'll be even less enforcement, if any. So I think for us, not only the two-state solution is the only viable way to think about ending the conflict and moving towards any kind of peaceful life together, but in the present, it's a really important way to talk about what's happening day in, day out in terms of settlement expansion. So when we talk about Atarot, when we talk about E1, when we talk about Givat Hamatos, these are all areas that are not only crucial for the two-state solution, these are areas that are crucial for Palestinian livelihood in the here and now. And by talking about the two-state solution, by using that as a way to remind the world of the enlarging occupation, of continuous taking over of land, we remind the world of its obligation to stand firm against that phenomenon. So again, we are not, we are there to talk and to think further and to elaborate any ideas, I would say, all in all, there are 450,000 settlers in the West Bank. This is not a lot. Some of them will obviously stay in any kind of solution or agreement under any kind of war that will be outlined. But we're not talking numbers that are impossible. A lot of people who talk about the impossibility of a two-state solution don't actually have maps and the facts and the idea that illegal outposts can be evicted, settlement expansion can be stopped. It's a matter of decision. It's a matter of the decision of the international community and Israel in a joint action. So, I am hopeful for the future of my homeland. I came back after 13 years, and it's the only place I can ever call home. But it will only be called home when people living across the border will have a peaceful life as the same that I am having right now.
I actually wanted to ask Madeline a question. Madeline spends a lot of her time with congressional staffers and members of Congress. And I'm just curious, Madeline, how this plays on Capitol Hill. Has this created any kind of echo?
Yeah, so there's definitely a growing interest in both settler violence, the issue, and also settlements. Last fall, we saw a letter led by now Secretary Haaland of the Interior when she was in Congress about settler violence. And it's something that I think might have been the first of its kind, and we need to continue pushing on that. And I know that the reception to this report on the Hill has been of great interest. And certainly it doesn't hurt that it's stayed in the news due to the other pieces around this. I think there's also been a growing concern on the Hill about settlements. There was, I think, like we discussed, an inclination to give a grace period to this new coalition and to think that this was going to be a change. And it's very clear that it's not. And they're just operating business as usual, except with the cover of not being Netanyahu. And so that has shifted, and there's been a growing appetite now on the Hill for pressure on Israel, whether that is pressure from Congress to the administration to pressure Israel, or other tweets or other statements that people are putting out. But it definitely, there is an appetite, and I think that's unfortunately only going to grow as Israel continues down this path. And I do want to thank everyone on this call. If you took action, we did an action alert recently around a letter on E1 urging the administration to push back on Israel and speak out on it. So we're hopeful that there'll be a response to that. It was a letter led by Congressman Mark Buchan. And I think in the new year, unfortunately, as Israel continues this path, we'll continue to see a response.
If we're going towards conclusion, if I may, a few words from myself. I want to thank everyone on this call listening or watching, and especially the Americans for Peace Now community for supporting us. As I said, this is a really crucial time for us. And I do want to end on a hopeful note. And we find this work incredibly hard. The analysis of settler violence just shows us what the physical costs of not saying anything and just being silent in the face of violence means. But we are hopeful because we think that things can and must be better and can be done differently. And it won't be without the support of our entire community. And I do see this as an inclusive community and all of us working together. So we are incredibly grateful for your support in so many ways and for your interest. And please do keep in touch in any way that works for you, and follow Americans for Peace Now online and Peace Now in English also. But do remember that any day that passes in which we don't take action means that lives are being hurt and that both interests are actually damaged. And both Israeli and Palestinian interests are damaged when the occupation continues. No one is free until everyone is free. And we're all under this onus of this occupation that I've been protesting since I'm 13. So thank you for your support, and thank you for helping us not only counter settler violence, but actually talk about settlements and bring that into the public sphere. And a big thank you to Americans for Peace Now for all that they do to bring that into the American public and to making this important topic visible all the time.
Dana, thank you so much. This is a great tone to close the conversation with. I want to thank everyone who joined us. Madeline, thank you very much for co-moderating this conversation with me. And of course, Dana, thank you too. I want to wish everyone a good, peaceful holiday season and a happy new year. We'll have a couple more, I think, webinars before the end of this year, plus a couple of interesting podcasts, including one that is our current podcast episode. Go ahead and listen to it. You can find it on Peacecast. Just Google Peacecast and you will find it. So again, thanks everyone. Thank you, Madeline. Thank you, Dana, and goodbye.